3D stealth-based gameplay had captured the attention of mainstream audiences, and had done so by cleverly exploring alternative approaches to interactive environments. Thanks to the ongoing success of the Metal Gear Tenchu and Thief series, stealth became a popular gameplay method, as well as a key selling point for fans of this emerging genre. As the 3D game space was probed and explored by developers looking to transpose ideas from the 2D realm and try new ones, stealth-based gameplay was used both to create and to augment a number of different franchises. Naturally, some of these were considered to be better or were more commercially successful than others. Perhaps it was because stealth-based gameplay gradually became so widespread, yet diverse in its execution, that the debate over what made a proper stealth game regularly flared up between fans of different series. But for those initial years, it was a debate that seemed to confine itself to 3D games alone. The almost gravitational pull of fleshy 3D worlds was too strong for developers and gaming audiences to ignore throughout the mid-2000s. It was a demonstration of technological advancement in home computers and consoles. It was the height of gaming fashion. 3D sold games. So it follows that very few developers or gamers seem to consider the 2D game space as a viable option for stealth-based gameplay. There were exceptions to this, of course. Ironically, thanks to the success of Hideo Kojima's 3D stealth game debut, Metal Gear Solid, Konami were keen to promote their recently rekindled Metal Gear brand, and this took the form of a 2D stealth game. In the first year of the new millennium, Konami released Metal Gear Ghost Babel on the Game Boy Color. Graphically, Metal Gear Ghost Babel was closer to its 1990 predecessor, Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake, but the stealth-based gameplay had significant alterations. All game sprites were capable of 8-directional movement. Snake could flatten himself against a wall to avoid notice, and while flattened he could knock to attract the attention of nearby guards. The partitioned screens of the original Metal Gear games were gone, leaving players with larger regions of scrolling game space to explore. The reactive radar tool, previously a grid of 9 squares, had been reduced to a single square, which highlighted enemies in the immediate vicinity of the player. The combat was more robust. Guards were knocked unconscious for a time, and the selected difficulty would determine both how many punches they could take and how long they stayed inactive. Metal Gear Ghost Babel was a critical success, viewed by older gamers as a celebration of the earlier days of a now popular franchise. But it was officially non-canon, and Kojima, the series' original creator, had planned to delve further into the 3D game space with his upcoming Metal Gear games. The Commandos series also continued to enjoy good sales figures and critical praise, thanks to fans of the real-time strategy genre who enjoyed its tightly focused, stealth-based missions. Commandos Behind Enemy Lines was successful enough for PYRO Studios to release first an expansion, Commandos Beyond the Call of Duty, and then 3 sequels, Commandos 2 Men of Courage, Commandos 3 Destination Berlin, and Commandos Strike Force. For the most part, these held onto and expanded upon the stealth-based gameplay that made the first entry in the series work so well. But they also made good use of increasingly detailed 3D assets against their isometric backdrops. An experimental switch to full 3D gameplay finally took place with the release of Commandos Strike Force in 2006. Despite retaining the stealth-based tactics that had made the previous Commandos games so interesting, the shift from tactical isometric to first-person gameplay was too big a change for long-term fans of the series. Perhaps by virtue of its insistence that players had to use careful, stealthy tactics, Commandos Strike Force also failed to appeal to fans of popular first-person shooter games set in World War II, such as the Call of Duty and Medal of Honor series. As for Oddworld Inhabitants, their projects following Oddworld Abe's Exodus adapted 3D gameplay, used more elaborately animated characters in cutscenes, and continued along the narrative path they'd begun in Oddworld Abe's Odyssey. Oddworld MUNCH'S Odyssey and Oddworld Stranger's Wrath both favoured new gameplay approaches, the former using 3D puzzle solving and platforming, while the latter adopted a more action-heavy approach with bursts of FPS gameplay. These games still continued Oddworld Inhabitants' fine tradition of interactive storytelling, and their commitment to the universe garnered a strong following. But Oddworld's 2D stealth phase was over. By the mid-2000s, 2D stealth games became a rarity. The subgenre had now failed to ignite twice. First in 1990, when fast-paced action games dominated the market, and second in 1998, when 3D games established themselves as the dominant medium. In 1990, it had been the stealth-based gameplay that failed to capture the attention of audiences and game developers. In 1998, it seemed to be the 2D aesthetic itself that was the problem. On both occasions, the notion of creating 2D stealth games had been badly timed. Consequently, throughout the mid-2000s, the 2D stealth game entered something of a regressive phase. The few examples we can find, in the form of simplistic browser-based and mobile titles, are more akin to the proto-stealth games we saw during the 1980s than their modern stealth counterparts. The Classroom series, released from 2003 to 2006, provides a good example. Players take on the role of a school bully attempting to cheat tests by copying from another student, while avoiding the gaze of their nemesis, the teacher. The Classroom game's fixed event scenarios and AI were designed with rigid precision. The only real variation from level to level was in how the teacher moved around the classroom and what distractions presented themselves. Everything was scripted into a single timeline of events, or a repeated pattern of events, and so the challenge lay in exploiting these to successfully cheat your way to success. The Classroom 2 introduced story sequences and added a small margin for error with the teacher's field of view, but it was still fiendishly difficult to avoid being caught, and the game relied on any given player's patience for a tricky process of trial and error. The Classroom 3 had a school corridor sequence for players to sneak through, where light and shadow even had a small part to play. But even this was scripted to the extent that players had to follow a specific route and time their moves with the kind of precision only possible through repeated attempts. Another example of the proto-stealth-like game development that took place in the mid-2000s is Ninja Rinse-Out. Ninja Rinse-Out consists of 10 stages, which are single-screen environments the player has to clear of enemies. At the end of the game, you rescue the Emperor's daughter, and you get an overall rating that takes into account how many guards you successfully killed while undetected. Enemies had 2 persisting states of awareness, triggered from passive to active by seeing the player character. There was no indication of how far they could see, or how visible you were. Their passive behaviour, much like that of the teacher in the Classroom games, was fixed. Ninja Rinse-Out seems to have been inspired by Tenchu's stealth assassins, but contains none of the tools required to conjure a stealth-based experience with any depth. One positive notion is that Ninja Rinse-Out emphasises the importance of stealth in tackling its brief realm of enemies. Ultimate Assassin, a browser-based game released in 2007, follows a similar aesthetic to the Classroom. People were represented as coloured dots in a map viewed from a top-down perspective. Unlike the Classroom games, Ultimate Assassin didn't rely on players reading and exploiting fixed patterns. Instead, the game tested your reactions to evolving scenarios, where a number of enemies were freely moving around the game space. Your objective? To eliminate the green guy without getting spotted by his security team, then escape the map when an opportunity presents itself. There were a couple of unique abilities to help you achieve this goal and avoid detection. At the press of a key, you could turn invisible or sprint for a few seconds. However, the invisibility only lasted for as long as your assassin stayed still, making it a tool of last resort for whenever they were cornered by foes. sprinting was the quickest way to kill a target or dash for cover before the security team could spot you. Although a promising concept, in practice, Ultimate Assassin seemed to rely more on blind luck than skill. Enemy movements were randomized, and if you were spotted, there was no chance to avoid an instant, bloody fail state. While browser-based game platforms became the temporary home for 2D stealth enthusiasts, and many of the games produced were less impressive than those found in mainstream gaming, there was the odd glimmer of brilliance. Ben Crawshaw's Trilby: The Art of Theft was released via The Escapist in 2007 as a free download. Set at the dawn of the 1990s, and perhaps appropriately presented in pixel graphics, Trilby: The Art of Theft tells the story of one egotistical, yet gentlemanly master thief, and his run-in with a corporation intent on using his skills for their own evil ends. The cutscenes, scrolling dialogue, and art style were minimalistic, but effective at immersing players in Crawshaw's Chapao City. The stealth-based gameplay also contained far more nuance than the browser-based proto-stealth throwbacks released during this time period, to the point where Trilby: The Art of Theft could easily be considered as a return to form for modern 2D stealth games. Trilby: The Art of Theft uses 3 levels of visibility. Low light, in which Trilby is completely invisible, medium light, where he can be spotted unless he flattens himself against a wall, and full light, where he can be seen regardless of how he's positioned. Human guards, security cameras, and laser sensors are the obstacles between Trilby and his loot, and each behave slightly differently. When triggered, they raise the alarm level of the area. If the player sets off one too many alarms, Trilby aborts the mission, and players have to try again. Guards can be neutralised with a nifty taser-tipped umbrella, which also serves as a grappling hook to quickly reach higher levels. However, Trilby prefers not to leave bodies lying around, so players are only allowed to knock out a few guards. Any more than that, and he automatically cancels the mission. A unique difference between Trilby: The Art of Theft and virtually every other stealth genre game to date is that the former's obstacles do not attempt to stop the player directly upon detection. There is no combat. Instead, their influence on the alarm level is applied as an active penalty. The emphasis throughout Trilby: The Art of Theft is placed on not being detected at all, though of course this takes greater degrees of skill and patience. Once again, the classic question mark and exclamation point symbols are used to alert players to guard awareness levels, though the margin for error is very small indeed. At the end of each mission, players are assigned a rank based on how much they stole, how many times they were spotted, how long they took to finish, and how many guards they knocked out. The higher ranks grant a significant boost to Trilby's reputation. Trilby begins his adventure with a basic moveset that allows him to use low-level and medium-level light for cover, move between floors, pick locks, and disable security systems, with a bit of luck depending on what wire you choose to cut. As you progress through the story and complete more heists, it's possible to buy skills for Trilby using his reputation points. These include the abilities to climb onto ceilings, roll through tight spaces, pick more complicated locks, as well as abilities that improve Trilby's camouflage and allow him to sprint. Sometimes an improved skill is needed to steal all the loot in a given mission, or completely avoid being detected, which lends a strong replayability to the game. There are also a couple of nods to well-known stealth game elements, like Metal Gear Solid's torture scene, and the film noir narrative style first seen in Thief the Dark Project. Thanks largely to Crawshaw's influence as a games critic and writer, Trilby: The Art of Theft has built up a cult following over the years, deservedly so. This was yet another 2D stealth game to be released ahead of its time, at a point in gaming history when independently developed projects were only just beginning to gain market momentum with mainstream audiences on PC and console. Who can say what would have happened if it had been released a year or two later when the indie game scene was more established? What is certain is that Trilby: The Art of Theft, though perhaps not as influential as later 2D stealth games, kept the idea of 2D stealth alive in the minds of many gamers and demonstrated how it could be used well as long as the level design prioritized skill over circumstance. A couple of years later, in 2009, Ultimate Assassin got a browser-based sequel, with notable improvements being made to the visual style, the gameplay, and the character animations. Most importantly, being detected by enemies no longer resulted in instant failure. In true stealth game fashion, enemies turn from passive obstacles to active obstacles and attempt to stop you when you're detected, but you can make a dash for cover and break their line of sight. By doing this, enemies enter a suspicious state of awareness and conduct a search for the player. Timer bars denote enemy alarm levels and how long players have to remain undetected after a successful kill. Although basic, Ultimate Assassin 2 was a comprehensive 2D stealth game, as was Trilby: The Art of Theft before it. Nevertheless, by 2009, the 2D stealth subgenre had fallen into even greater obscurity. In the world of the mainstream stealth enthusiast, 3D stealth games were still the games that mattered most. But a renaissance was on the horizon. In the final chapter of 2D stealth games, we look at how this subgenre managed to thrive, the conditions that made this possible, and the games that have driven its ongoing development. I'd like to thank my sponsors on Patreon and my subscribers here on YouTube. Your support for the work I do here is always appreciated. If you're a new viewer and you want to see more of these videos, you should definitely hit the subscribe button. And if you'd like to take your support that extra step further, you can pledge $1 or $5 on my Patreon page. Sharing this video, leaving feedback, or hitting the like button are great ways to show your support as well. Thank you very much for watching. You'll hear from me again soon.